How to check and what to look for when you want to buy a car with an automatic transmission, or if you already have one and suspect it's starting to fail. Here, I will mainly refer to classic automatic transmissions, those with a torque converter, but this information is applicable to about 90% of transmissions, including those with dual clutch, known as DSG by VW, as well as to robotized automated manual transmissions and to the CVT transmissions, specific to Japanese brands and others. What does a classic transmission with a torque converter mean? It refers to the majority of German transmissions, but not only older and found in most cars with automatic transmissions. The first thing you need to do chronologically when you start the engine is to shift from P to D, from park to drive. Normally, it should engage immediately when the lever is moved from P to D or to R, with R meaning reverse. In less than a second, the car should give the sensation that it wants to move off. It's somewhat similar to the situation where a manual car is put into gear, the brake is pressed, and you gently release the clutch so that it engages slightly but not enough to stall the engine. This applies to older generation transmissions with a torque converter. Cars with CVT, automated manual transmission, or DSG do not do this, not because they are defective, but because that's how the transmissions are designed. With a worn transmission, nothing happens for about a second, and then it engages suddenly. When it engages, it feels like a shock in the transmission and as if someone has hit the car. This is a classic automatic transmission with a torque converter from a Ford Galaxy. When I shift to R from reverse, nothing happens for about a second, and then it engages abruptly and jerks. It doesn't have to be like that. The transition should be somewhat quick, not instantaneous, but quick and smooth. The next step in checking the gearbox when you want to buy a car with an automatic transmission is to open the car window to better hear what's happening outside, and in total silence, play with the lever. Shift it from P, park, to D, drive, to R, reverse, to sport, and through the gears 4, 3, 2, depending on how each gearbox is configured. If the gears can also be manually selected, move from N neutral to first gear, back to neutral, to R reverse, and so on. If the gearbox is in good condition, there should be the classic gear shifting sound, somewhat similar to the sound a manual gearbox makes when shifting from first to second to third gear, etc. The sound is indeed a bit more pronounced, but you should not hear any strong, metallic rattling in some cases, nor should there be any kind of thumping in the gearbox, and the car should not jerk during the shift. This is an automatic transmission from a Toyota Land Cruiser J100. If I accelerate harder from a stop when shifting from first to second gear, there's a popping sound. Another issue with automatic transmissions that are nearing the end of their lifespan occurs when shifting into D from drive. The engine tends to stall. The RPMs decrease significantly, the car starts to shudder, and it feels similar to a manual transmission in first gear with the brake pressed and the clutch halfway engaged, almost to the point where the engine dies. It's as if the engine is both under load and locked at the same time. Or if the transmission is truly worn, whether in cold conditions, and sometimes even when warm, when shifting from N to D, the engine completely stalls. However, make sure not to have too high expectations in this regard, because a slight decrease in RPMs, an increase in idle consumption, and some additional vibrations of the car are entirely normal. Yet, there is a limit, and perhaps the most visible sign is the needle of the tachometer oscillating up and down. The next chronological step when you want to buy a car with a traditional automatic transmission with a torque converter is to shift the lever into D while your foot is on the brake, and then suddenly remove your foot from the brake. Within a maximum of 1 second, the car should smoothly start moving. Smoothly means smoothly. Almost any car starts moving the moment you take your foot off the brake, but not every car moves off smoothly. If you take your foot off the brake and nothing happens for a second, after which the car suddenly moves off as if someone hit you from behind, or as if in a manual transmission you lifted your foot off the clutch abruptly enough to jerk, but not so abruptly that the engine dies, it is most likely that the valve body or valve block needs to be replaced. Now, the car should smoothly start moving. After you have started moving, switch from automatic to manual mode. Manual doesn't mean a clutch appears out of nowhere. Rather, on the right side of the lever, there is a new section marked with a plus and a minus. Or, on some cars, there are paddle shifters behind the steering wheel. Shift gears manually, but not just anyway. Do it as follows. The ideal case is on a slight incline, so the car is somewhat under load. At a constant RPM of 2000 or 2500, shift from first to second gear. It may seem paradoxical, but if the car is accelerating or braking, the text might not be as relevant. It's best if the RPM, and thus the speed, is constant. At the moment of shifting, the change will be somewhat more abrupt than usual, but again, the car should not jerk as if it were hit, and there should be no banging noise from the engine or transmission. If you can turn on the air conditioning while doing this, it's even better. Apparently, these two mechanisms are unrelated, but the air conditioning does use engine power, thus creating an additional load and consequently an extra shock during gear changes. This was true even when the cars were new, so we shouldn't be alarmed if, in a car of 10 or 20 years, the shock is slightly greater than with the air conditioning turned off. Of course, this is also true for manual transmissions. When you suddenly take the car out of gear while driving, you'll notice that if the air conditioning is on, the RPM will drop more quickly than if it's off, not to mention the well-known fact that the car loses a certain percentage of power. The next step would be to switch back to drive and perform a kickdown. This means, at a constant RPM of up to 2000, in third, fourth, or fifth gear, you press the pedal all the way down. On some cars, at the end of the pedal's travel, there's an additional click that needs to be pressed further, after which the pedal can be pressed down about another 1 centimeter. This click is designed for situations where, for example, the car is in eco mode, so it knows you want to switch to sport mode for a short period, or if in normal mode, a kickdown would downshift 1 gear, it indicates that you want to accelerate abruptly and downshift 2 gears. Thus, it's a way to tell the car you want to accelerate suddenly. However, this is not applicable to all cars. In short, normally, a sudden press of the pedal causes the car to downshift 1 gear, for example, from 5th to 4th, while on a kickdown, the car downshifts 2 gears from 5th to 3rd. It goes without saying that if the car is in 2nd gear, it will not shift to neutral. During a kickdown, the shift will be more abrupt and noisier, but again, there shouldn't be a strong metallic clunk as if someone were hammering on the gearbox. The heavier the car, if the gearbox or valve group is worn, the more pronounced the clunk will feel. The strongest clunks I've ever heard are from large BMWs. X5, X6, Series 7. By comparison, the noise and feeling should be similar to a manual transmission when the car is driven sportily and gears are shifted abruptly at high RPMs. This applies to traditional torque converter boxes, automated manual transmissions, and DSGs. As a fun fact, from a sportiness perspective, a car with a worn transmission or one that hasn't had its oil changed for a long time will be more sporty and have better acceleration performance than one with a transmission in good condition. This is because the abrupt shift leads to a quicker coupling. The shock from the gearbox provides an impulse to the wheels, making the actual gear change more brutal, and as a result, the car drives more sportily. This is how the gearboxes of rally cars are set to shift gears as abruptly and quickly as possible, of course, at the expense of longevity. However, this is not an important aspect for race cars, since they are changed after 1, 2, or 3 races anyway. For regular cars, of course, this unwanted sport mode will not last long. When they reach the end of their life, automatic transmissions often get stuck in 3rd gear. Many of them are set this way because third gear is low enough for the car to start moving and high enough to allow for decent speed. However, this rule does not always apply, so the transmission can get stuck in any gear. Before completely locking up when cold, the transmission does not shift gears at all. When shifting from parking to drive, the phenomenon I just mentioned occurs, and then, during the initial seconds and then minutes until the oil warms up, the transmission does not shift gears at all. It then starts to shift gears, but with difficulty. If you notice that, especially in cold weather, the car engages gears and shifts harder and at higher RPMs than normal, try changing the transmission fluid. You might be lucky, and that might be all that's needed. This oil is by no means lifetime. It definitely needs to be changed. And as a mechanic joked, the oil isn't even lifetime if it stays in the bottle in the store. It expires after a few years. All the more so, it will lose its properties after being used in the transmission, engine, or any other system it's meant for. The oil change should be done at intervals of 60 to 100,000 kilometers. All gearboxes, or in general, all assemblies that use oil need an oil change at a certain interval. However, be aware that changing the oil in the gearbox is a somewhat more complicated operation than changing the engine oil. Therefore, make sure to give your car to a skilled and experienced mechanic in this niche. One aspect that few mechanics know is that the lack of oil in the gearbox can cause limp mode or emergency mode. In short, this means the car loses a significant part of its power, the RPM is limited to the 2,000–3,000 range, and even up to those RPMs, the car accelerates much harder than usual, and a warning light may appear on the dashboard. However, it's not mandatory because not all cars have such warning indicators. Most cars have a limited number of kilometers they can go in emergency mode before they stop completely. Of course, not only the lack of oil in the gearbox can cause the car to enter emergency mode. This is quite a rare case, and limp mode can also be triggered by a simple sensor. If you've noticed this with your car that you've had for a long time, there's no need to panic, just top up or change the oil. Find out the cause of its disappearance from the gearbox, and the problem is solved. If you're looking to buy a car with such a problem, my advice is to avoid it. Because if the car has driven many kilometers like this, the gearbox is likely compromised. It's as if a car would drive many kilometers without oil in the engine. It's not excluded that it may still drive a few kilometers, but not many. Another symptom of very worn gearboxes is that they cannot keep up with sudden decelerations. Specifically, if you're driving at about 100 km/h in 5th or 6th gear and then brake suddenly, if the gearbox is on its last legs, the engine will stall, or if it's very worn, the engine will be on the verge of stalling. The RPMs will drop to around 500–600 and the engine will shudder. By comparison, if you brake suddenly in a manual transmission car in 5th gear at 100 km/h without pressing the clutch, the RPMs will drop suddenly and then the engine will stall. The same kind of thing will happen with a worn automatic. After you've braked, accelerate abruptly again up to about 100 km/h, preferably with the engine under as much load as possible, so uphill with the car loaded and the air conditioning turned on. Again, a worn automatic will jerk at the moment of shifting, and you will hear the clunks we just discussed. Equally problematic is the flip side, meaning when the car shifts gears very slowly and the clutch slips a lot between shifts. It's as if someone were driving a manual and letting off the clutch very slowly between gears while pressing the accelerator quite a bit. In short, gear shifts should be similar to when a manual transmission is driven by a professional driver. They shouldn't be rushed and jerky, nor should they be excessively slow to the point where the clutch disc slips a lot. Even with an older generation transmission, the shift should take no more than a second and be performed smoothly and naturally, without excessively increasing or decreasing the engine RPM during the shift. Another check you should perform is to switch the lever to the so-called Tronic manual mode and go through each gear speed. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, depending on how many it has. I suppose it's unnecessary to mention that the car should be able to engage all gears. If you're driving at a low speed and the car doesn't want to shift into higher gears, it doesn't necessarily mean the transmission is worn out. It has a protection mechanism to prevent shifting into fifth gear at 40 km/h because it would kill the engine. Conversely, it also won't allow shifting into second gear at a speed of 120 km/h for obvious reasons. Ideally, all these checks should be performed both cold and warm. I'm aware that 99% of sellers won't agree to all the checks I've mentioned. These checks can only be done if it's your personal car and you suspect it's beginning to fail. Some sellers might agree but don't have the time, or if you've arranged a meeting place, the person likely drove the car from their home to the meeting spot, and the oils have warmed up. But if these checks can be performed in both situations, that's perfect. However, if they can't be done in both situations, it's best to have checked the car when it's cold. At the first start, especially if it's cold outside, all these defects will be more pronounced and easier to detect. After you've made all these checks, go through all the gear lever positions again. P, D, N, R. 4, 3, 2. The lever, like the gear shifter on manual cars, should move easily from one position to another. It shouldn't snag, requiring forceful pulling or jerking the car during the shift. If it's going to snag, it snags when cold. Again, I remind you not to go from one extreme to the other. The fact that you shouldn't hear strange metallic noises or strong thuds doesn't mean that the shifting should be completely silent. The sound of shifting gears will be somewhat louder than in the same car with a manual transmission. Here are some quick facts for those who have never driven automatics before and are considering getting one for the first time. Many of these cars have, besides PRND, the options 4, 3, 2. On 4, the gearbox will not shift beyond the fourth gear, so you won't see the fifth. On 3, it will stop at the third gear, so it won't shift into the fourth or fifth, and so on. So when you're buying an automatic, you can check this aspect as well. For transmissions that also have a sport mode, the shift time does not shorten. Instead, the RPM at which the gearbox shifts up increases. So if normally the car shifts from third to fourth at 2,000 RPM, in sport mode, it will shift around 2,500 to 3,000 RPM. Thus, if it doesn't shift gears faster in sport mode, it doesn't mean there is a problem with the gearbox. That's just how it works. We are not talking about supercars here, where indeed sport mode also shortens the gear shift time. We are talking about normal cars with automated dual-clutch or torquey converter transmissions. Before concluding, I want to make some very important clarifications. A car with a bad transmission does not necessarily have to exhibit all the symptoms we've discussed. It is enough to have just one, for example. It's enough that in cold conditions, at a constant speed and at a rotation of 2,500 RPM, when shifting from first to second gear, if the engine jolts, you know that gearbox won't last long. If these problems manifest to a very small extent, especially when cold, and then the car returns to normal after warming up, you might be lucky enough to get away with just a gearbox oil change. But if you lack experience, my advice is to buy such a car only with the help of a mechanic. If the gearbox shifts perfectly in all the situations listed earlier, you don't necessarily need a mechanic, at least from this point of view. But if you have any suspicions, it would be best to have someone assist you. After you've bought such a car, if you don't have clear evidence that the oil was changed in the last 60,000 kilometers, change it yourself. But not just by anyone, rather by someone experienced. I guess it goes without saying that it's not just the gearbox oil that needs changing, but also the engine oil, filters, timing belt, antifreeze, and possibly brake discs and pads, along with other consumables that need to be replaced on any type of car, regardless of the transmission. On average, changing the oil in a DSG gearbox is somewhat more expensive than in other types of gearboxes. If you want to check the gearbox oil yourself, Don't follow all the nonsense tutorials on the net because there isn't a dipstick to indicate the oil level like there is for engine oil. Indeed, some cars have such a dipstick, but the majority do not. My advice is not to take too great risks when buying an automatic because its replacement is much more expensive than replacing a manual one. The repair is more costly and more complicated. For example, replacing a mere valve body in a 2004 Charan costs $1,000 a year. Considering this car has among the cheapest parts, you wouldn't want to know how much this operation costs for a Mercedes ML W166. In the previous video about automatic transmissions, I received many questions about various specific situations of different cars. Unfortunately, a diagnosis cannot be made through YouTube comments. If you experience any of the previously described symptoms, try changing the oil first. Professionally speaking, if the problem persists, go to a mechanic specialized in automatic transmissions. It's nearly impossible for any mechanic to detect a problem without a diagnosis, without a test, and without a thorough inspection of the car. However, if you have questions, write to us in the comment section. I promise to answer all the questions I know the answer to. If I don't know the answer, but the question is read by someone who has faced an identical problem with an identical car, and you're lucky, you might find the answer from someone in this community. Now on the screen, you have other videos that address similar topics, or even an entire playlist about such things. See you in any of the envelopes on the screen.